Thank you so much, Patty. Thank you all for being here at this time of great upheaval in Russia again. Here's the book. Oh, there it is. The Red Hotel.
Fantastic.
There we go. We got to get your name there, Alan.
Beth.
So before we start, can you just tell everybody a little bit about your career in Moscow, about your career more generally, and what it was that brought you to write this book?
Well, first, it's a great honor to speak to an organization which is founded to promote press freedom and to talk about propaganda and disinformation. Well, my career started in 1979 when I was the Reuters trainee in Moscow. They always had a trainee there to man the desk, the news agency desk in the evening, and watch the evening news and see if any of the newsreaders was wearing a black tie. If they're wearing a black tie, it meant that Brezhnev might be dead, or on any one of the old crocs. So if that was the case, you had to tell the bureau chief and sort of try and find out what was happening. So I did that for a year and ended up with the Moscow Olympics, if anyone can remember that. And I was next in Moscow at the beginning of the Gorbachev era, 1985, but I got caught up in what was called the Gordievsky affair. Margaret Thatcher expelled more than 20 Soviet spies from London, so the Russians retaliated, and I was one of the ones who had to go. Anyway, before I went to Moscow, I had been posted by Reuters to Tunis, not the world's most important news place, to cover North Africa, and the press corps was about three people. The most interesting of the three people was a woman called Tanya Matthews. She'd been born Tanya Svetlova in Grozny. At that time, when she was born, the center of the oil industry. Anyway, there wasn't much news to cover, but we used to have long lunches at her lovely place in Tunis, a seaside village, all blue and white, Sidi Bou Said. And she explained that she'd managed to escape the Soviet Union by becoming an interpreter, a sort of what was called a secretary translator for one of the British journalists who came out to Russia in 1941 to cover the Eastern Front. They didn't do much covering of the Eastern Front at the time because they weren't allowed anywhere near it. But anyway, some of the correspondents got pretty close to their translators. Anyway, so she married a correspondent called Matthews. Anyway, so she told me, and then she ended up in Tunis actually as the BBC correspondent. So she graduated from translator to correspondent. She told me all about what went on in the Metropole, and I thought, this is a fascinating story, but why has no one ever written it? Anyway, I went back to Moscow in '85, not for very much long, 4 or 5 months, and I wasn't allowed back as a permanent correspondent until '94 to '98. I was there. Anyway, it took even longer than that to get to grips with the story. I was actually at the Metropole Hotel, which you, of course, know very well, and some other people listening may know it, for a charity ball, of all things. Such things existed then. And a friend gave me a newly published book, A History of the Metropole, and I looked for the wartime chapter, and there I found some useful leads, not just Tanya, particularly an extraordinary woman called Nadia Ulanovskaya, who was born in what is now Ukraine, a rather benighted shtetl, and seized with both hands the liberation which came with the Bolshevik Revolution. And she fought with the Bolsheviks in a civil war, and then went abroad for military intelligence, spying in Hamburg, Shanghai, and 2 years in New York. Anyway, So I found her story, and when I finally left Chatham House, where I'd been working, I had enough to build on what I knew from Tanya in person and from Nadia's memoirs and some recollections, diaries, and things of the British and American reporters to build it up.
Yeah, in fact, Alan, there had been things written about this, but they were written as individual memoirs.
Individual memoirs, yes.
Yeah, so can you talk about the research process more generally?
Well, the key person was Nadia Ulanovskaya, with her good English from having spent 2 years in New York. She was basically appointed as the chief translator to keep an eye on the others. It was a strange time in the fact that there was complete fraternization was allowed in the metropole between the foreigners and the Soviet citizens, which wasn't allowed anywhere else in Stalin's time. That was to keep the journalists quiet since they weren't really allowed to do their job. Anyway, she never wrote anything. She'd spent quite a long time in the Gulag, which we could get onto later. But her daughter did sit her down and put a tape recorder in front of her. So there was a slightly incoherent memories in Russian, which could be put together to make a story very successfully. As for going to Russia, there weren't any archives I could find. I could go there. There would be many more secrets in the KGB archives. I'd love to know what was written about this time. Of course, but I don't imagine that's going to happen for years to come. So, there was quite a lot of information in the British archives, the National Archives, not from MI6, the Foreign Intelligence Service, but from the Domestic Security Service, because they were keeping a very close eye on the correspondent for the Times, the London Times, and the New York Times, who was called Ralph Parker. And he also wrote for the New York Times as well, because he liked to dabble a bit in spying for both sides, and no one trusted him. Anyway, so there was useful information there. There were the descendants of people who worked there, all very keen. Sorry, not all. Some of them very keen, some of them not so keen to talk about what had gone on there. So, yeah, there weren't any useful archives I could look at in Russia. And someone who I really wanted to talk to, who might have talked to me 10 years before, because he actually got hold of one of my colleagues at the Times to talk about this time. He decided that it wasn't in his interest to participate in a book which might be seen as Russophobic or whatever. So that's the guidelines.
How frustrating. But you did speak with some of the relatives of the primary movers in the book.
Yes. When you're doing this kind of research, you always need a bit of luck. And to find out more about Ralph Parker, who was a mysterious person who no one really trusted, he wasn't content to be a journalist. He liked to do a little bit of spying, or at least sort of exchanging intelligence, to make himself feel big. Anyway, his first wife was Czech, and I wanted to find out more from the Czech side. I had no contacts in the Czech Republic. So what we all do, I went to Google and I asked Google for a list of Czech historians at British universities, and it came up with about a dozen. And I looked at these, and one of them was at Warwick, where my son had been. I thought, well, I'll try her. So he said, oh, well, I'm sorry to disturb you. Can you point me to someone who could do some research for me, blah, blah, blah. And she said, oh, no, you don't need to do that. I know the Hofbauer family of old. I grew up next door to them. I will introduce you to all of them. So that was a bit of luck, for example. So they were very keen to talk. In fact, the woman I really wanted to speak to, by the time I got there, she was actually, unfortunately, on her deathbed. But she was so organized that she got her niece to come from Hungary with pictures, letters, and stories. So they were very keen to help, for example. On the
Wow.
other, on the other side, in one book, there's you might call, I suppose he's the baddie of the journalists. He's a very ambitious Australian. I don't know if there are any Australian journalists listening here, Australian, who played the system very well. Um, when he was in Moscow, he sort of kept his nose clean and filed a lot of stuff, pretty propagandistic. But all the time, he was um, getting all the information he could get, writing it in a tiny hand in little notebooks from Nadia, his interpreter, and he found out everything about what had happened in the 30s, the reality of life in the Soviet Union. None of this went into what he reported for any newspaper. It wouldn't get past the censor anyway. And he even persuaded her to take him to visit a Soviet family in their homes. Now, this very simple journalistic exercise, which you'd give to a sort of trainee on day one, was completely banned. You were not allowed to see how they lived, the cramped living conditions, basically. And Nadia said to him, if you publish this, it could be bad for me. And he said, don't worry, Nadia, it'll be a novel. Well, he did write a novel, but he barely disguised Nadia. In fact, he even used her name for one of the characters. So it didn't take the KGB of the time a long time to find her, and she ended up in the Gulag, not actually far from where Navalny's been, in Vorkuta, inside the Arctic Circle. Yes, who didn't want to talk? So his daughter was very suspicious of me. And I did actually go and see her because of my Reuters training. You have to get both sides of the story. Anyway, she did open the door to me. We agreed. She didn't offer me a glass of water or even a cup of coffee, but basically she said, if you tell anything to a journalist, whatever it is, you must expect it to appear in print sooner or later. I think that doesn't really apply to people who help you in dictatorial regimes. In fact, I don't think it applies at all in dictatorial regimes. Anyway, that was their story.